What if I told you that masturbation, yes, the thing no one wants to talk about, is quietly stealing your energy, your drive, and your potential? I know. That sounds dramatic, maybe even ridiculous. But think about it for a second. You wake up tired. You lose focus faster. You say you want to change, to level up, to be more disciplined, but by evening you're back in that same cycle. A screen, a scroll, a moment of release. Then emptiness. They told you it was harmless, normal, even healthy. And maybe sometimes it is. But what if it's not the act itself? What if it's what it represents? What if every time you reach for it, you're not satisfying a need, you're surrendering your power? This isn't about shame, it's about attention, about where your life force is going, and more importantly, where it's not. Because men weren't made to live behind screens, chasing pixels. We were made to build, to lead, to endure, to protect, and deep down, I think you know that. The ancient Stoics believed that a man who cannot master his desires is a man ruled by them. And in a world that profits from your distractions, your ability to focus is your superpower. So if you've ever felt like something's missing, like you're tired of wasting your fire on things that leave you emptier, then this is for you. Let's talk about what happens when you stop masturbating and start reclaiming the man you were always meant to be. This isn't about quitting a habit. It's about waking up. Let's begin. There's a strange silence in today's world, not because nothing's wrong, but because what's wrong has become normal. Walk into any college dorm, bachelor apartment, or late-night bedroom, and you'll find the same pattern: dim lights, a screen glowing, headphones on, and a man alone. Masturbation has become so routine that it's rarely questioned. It's treated like brushing your teeth, something quick, private, harmless. But what if the truth is far more complicated? Let's not talk science just yet. Let's talk feeling. You finish, and there's that brief wave of satisfaction. But what follows? A slump, a strange emptiness, maybe even guilt. You lie there, energy drained, scrolling through a feed that suddenly feels meaningless. And you tell yourself, next time I'll do better. But next time looks a lot like the last. This isn't just about sex, it's about control. It's about how modern men, strong, intelligent, ambitious men, are slowly being lulled into passivity. We're overstimulated and underfulfilled. Porn delivers fake novelty. Masturbation delivers fake release. And the mind, tricked by these simulations, stops seeking the real thing: growth, purpose, connection. I remember a friend, James, a bright guy, talented musician. He had big dreams but was stuck in a cycle: late nights, porn, gaming, repeat. When he finally took a 30-day break from porn and masturbation, something wild happened. He started waking up earlier, writing music again, even talking to strangers with ease. It's like I had all this noise in my head before, he told me, and it finally went quiet. Here's the lesson: it's not about moral purity. It's about mental clarity, about taking back the energy you've been unknowingly giving away. And the scary part, this epidemic isn't obvious. It doesn't ruin your life overnight. It just slows you down week by week until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize the man staring back. But there's a way out, and to find it, we need to understand what's really happening inside your brain and why pleasure has become a trap. Let's talk about that next. Every time you open that tab, your brain lights up, not metaphorically, literally. A surge of dopamine floods your system, the same chemical hit you'd get from drugs, winning money, or being praised in front of a crowd. Except this one is effortless, instant, and artificial. See, your brain evolved in a very different world than the one you live in now. Thousands of years ago, dopamine was a reward for doing something hard: hunting, building shelter, earning respect. It said, "Good job, keep going." But today, you can trigger the same feeling with a few taps. No effort, no risk. It feels like a win. But your life hasn't moved forward 1 inch. This is the hijack. Imagine rewarding yourself with a gold medal every time you think about training instead of actually showing up at the gym. That's what dopamine through porn and masturbation does. The reward comes before the effort. And your brain, brilliant but gullible, believes it's already succeeded. So why chase anything else? I knew a guy named Ethan, mid-20s. Smart, full of ideas, always talking about launching his own business. But he never started. Instead, he'd binge-watch porn during stress, feel better for an hour, then hate himself by midnight. He wasn't lazy, he was tricked. His brain had been rewired to feel accomplished without accomplishing anything. That's the scary part. The more you use masturbation as a quick fix, the more your brain links it to relief, stress, porn boredom, porn loneliness, porn. Over time, your tolerance builds. The highs fade, the lows deepen, and your ability to sit with discomfort, something every great man must learn, erodes. Here's the quiet tragedy. We stop pursuing greatness not because we're not capable, but because we already feel rewarded for doing nothing. That's what dopamine overload steals from you, your fire, your hunger, your why. But there's a way to flip the script. The Stoics, long before we had MRI scans and brain chemistry, saw this trap clearly. They warned us about what happens when men are ruled by pleasure, and their wisdom may be exactly what we need to break free. Let's revisit their words and see how timeless they truly are. Long before we had the language of dopamine or neural pathways, there were men who understood something profound, that unchecked desire, no matter how small, can undo a man from the inside out. The Stoics weren't monks hiding from life. They were emperors, generals, philosophers, men who stood in the center of chaos and still chose discipline over indulgence. And their warnings weren't abstract. They were clear, practical, and urgent. Seneca once wrote, "No man is free who is a slave to his body." That line may sound poetic, but it hits hard when you sit alone in a dark room, phone in hand, heart beating, and realize you're not really choosing anymore, you're reacting. Your body urges, you obey over and over again. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome and commander of armies, believed that mastering the self was the only true victory. He journaled nightly about resisting temptation, rising above impulse, and acting in alignment with reason. He ruled the known world, yet feared becoming a slave to his own desires. Think about that. And Epictetus, born into slavery, he taught that the highest freedom isn't external, it's internal. You can be rich, praised, envied, and still be a prisoner. But the man who controls himself, that man is untouchable. Now, picture this in today's world. A young man wakes up, scrolls through his feed, and by noon he's already given in once, maybe twice. By evening, his sense of focus is shot, his ambition dulled. He doesn't know why he feels off, but something's missing. The Stoics would see it instantly. He's not in command. I had a coaching client once, let's call him Brian. High-achieving student, well-spoken, but always tired, always distracted. He came to me thinking he had an attention problem. What we found instead was a pattern of self-indulgence that had quietly built walls around his potential. Once he understood that every click, every just this one time, was a vote for chaos over clarity, things started to shift. He didn't need more motivation. He needed alignment. And that's what the Stoics offer us, a way back to center. A reminder that real masculinity isn't about suppression, it's about sovereignty. The power to say no, not out of fear, but out of purpose. But understanding the warnings is just the first step. To break free from this trap, we need to look at what we're really chasing and why it leaves us emptier every time. Let's explore that next. Pleasure by itself isn't the enemy. In fact, it's a gift. It's nature's way of saying, that felt good, do more of it. But when pleasure comes without purpose, without effort, without meaning, it slowly begins to rot us from the inside. There's a kind of hunger that no amount of gratification can fill. You've probably felt it. You finish watching something explicit, you scroll until your thumb aches, you order food you don't need, and still something inside feels hollow. That's not failure. That's your soul calling out for something real. See, our minds were built to seek earned reward, building a shelter, solving a problem, protecting someone we love. Those things used to bring meaning, not just satisfaction. But in today's world, where everything is on demand, we get the reward without the journey. And that shortcut has a cost. A good friend of mine, Chris, Used to say he felt like a spectator in his own life. "I'm watching myself fade," he told me once after another relapse. The pattern was always the same: stress, escape, short-term high emptiness. What turned things around for him wasn't stricter rules or longer streaks, it was purpose. He started volunteering at a local gym, coaching young athletes. He wasn't paid, but suddenly he had boys looking up to him, people depending on him. The first week, he barely made it 3 days without relapsing. By week 4, he didn't even think about it. Not because he didn't have urges, but because he had something better to aim at. And that's the lesson: pleasure is hollow when it doesn't serve a deeper purpose. When your days are filled with distractions and dopamine, your spirit starts to starve. But when you replace passive pleasure with meaningful effort, something changes. You stop chasing a high and start living with depth. The Stoics knew this. They believed that without a clear sense of direction, men become slaves to every passing impulse. That's why they taught purpose as a compass. Something to return to when the noise gets loud. Something to anchor you when the old habits come calling. So if you feel stuck, unmotivated, or lost in cycles, you might not need more discipline. You might just need a better reason to get up in the morning. But even with purpose, there's still one more ingredient the Stoics believed every man must master: how to use his energy, not just suppress it. Let's dive into that next. There's a force inside every man, raw, restless, and powerful. You've felt it before. That surge of energy late at night. That fire in your chest when you watch someone achieve greatness. That strange urgency when you're alone with your thoughts. It's not weakness, it's potential, but most men never learn how to use it. Instead, they drain it quietly, repeatedly, through habits that offer release, not purpose. Sexual energy isn't just about biology. It's the root of drive, creativity, ambition, even courage. Ancient cultures knew this. In Hinduism, it's called ojas; in Taoism, it's life force; and in Stoicism, though the word wasn't used directly, the principle was clear: your power grows when your passions are under your command. But what happens when that energy is spent on fantasy? You may feel a moment of relief, but your deeper self, the one that dreams, builds, leads, gets quieter. Over time, something subtle fades. You become more passive, less hungry, more reactive, less driven. A client I once worked with, Mark, was a gifted designer, but he always struggled to finish projects. His energy was scattered, his focus inconsistent. After tracking his habits, he realized he was releasing 2, sometimes 3 times a day. "It's just my way of unwinding," he said. But when he decided to go 30 days without it, not to punish himself, but to redirect, something shifted. His ideas got sharper, his eyes looked clearer. He pitched a design to a client he'd been avoiding for months and got the job. What changed? He stopped wasting his fire and started using it. This is what thinkers like Nikola Tesla understood. Tesla was known for his celibacy, not because he was afraid of women, but because he believed his sexual energy fueled his genius. "I do not think you can name many great inventions that have been made by married men," he once said. He chose to channel, not suppress. That's the difference. Suppression says don't feel this. Transmutation says feel it and then use it. And that's the invitation Stoicism offers: take what's wild in you and aim it at something worthy. Your mission, your craft, your legacy. But you can't do that if you still believe this energy is something shameful or meaningless. It's not. It's sacred. And when you begin to channel it, truly channel it, something extraordinary starts to happen. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. How one simple decision to stop chasing empty highs can lead to a chain reaction of clarity, confidence, and power. Let's see what happens when you truly take control. One of the most dangerous lies a man can tell himself is, "I can stop anytime." It sounds confident, in control, rational, but behind that sentence often hides a deeper truth: he already tried and failed. See, most men don't realize they're caught in a loop until the loop has closed around them. You go a few days without giving in, you feel strong, clear-headed, but then one stressful night hits, or boredom creeps in, or a random image shows up in your feed, and suddenly you're back. The same cycle, the same emptiness. And worse, that voice, "It's fine. Everyone does it. You'll quit next week." This is how the illusion works. It convinces you that you're in charge, while pulling the strings behind the curtain. There's a term in psychology called intermittent reinforcement. It's how slot machines get people addicted. You don't win every time, but just often enough to keep chasing the high. Porn and masturbation work the same way. The momentary hit of pleasure acts like a reward, even when it follows guilt, shame, or regret. The unpredictability is the hook. I once mentored a guy named Leo. Bright, ambitious, loved philosophy. He swore he had it under control. "It's just a weekend thing," he told me. But when we looked closer, he realized weekends had stretched into weekdays, then into breaks between classes, then late nights that turned into early mornings. What shocked him most wasn't how often he gave in, but how automatic it had become. And here's the truth: habits like these don't just stay in one box. They bleed into your mood, your sleep, your focus, your relationships. They don't ruin your life all at once. They erode it slowly, so you hardly notice until your edge is gone. But here's the good news: the illusion can be broken. The moment you stop negotiating with the habit and start observing it honestly. Leo didn't need to punish himself. He needed to map the pattern. He began journaling every urge, every trigger, and in just 1 week, he could predict when it would hit. That awareness gave him space, and in that space, he made better choices. That's the lesson here. You can't conquer what you pretend isn't a problem. Real strength begins with radical honesty, and once you see the loop for what it is, you can begin to reclaim something deeper, not just your control, but your presence. Your ability to stand tall, make eye contact, and walk into a room without shame. Let's talk next about how this habit affects that quiet confidence and what happens when you start to take it back. Confidence isn't always loud. It doesn't need to walk into a room shouting or showing off. Real confidence is quiet, steady, a kind of calm that others feel before you even speak. But here's the part no one tells you: that energy, that presence, it leaks every time you indulge in a habit that makes you feel small afterward. It's not just about the act of masturbation. It's about the aftermath, the emotional residue you carry without realizing it. The tiny voice that whispers, "You failed again." The subtle guilt that clings to your skin the next morning. The way your eyes drop a little sooner when someone holds your gaze. Over time, that residue builds. You stop trusting yourself. You don't notice it at first. Maybe you laugh a little less, speak a little softer, hesitate more when opportunity knocks. But it's there, in how you sit, how you breathe, how you look at the world, and how you assume it's looking at you. I remember talking with Malik, a young man who always seemed a bit closed off. He was sharp, kind, talented, but you could feel a wall around him. He spoke with downward glances, rarely initiated conversation, and seemed uncomfortable in his own skin. When we finally got honest about his habits, he admitted he'd been stuck in a cycle of daily porn and masturbation since high school. We worked on just one thing: presence. Instead of focusing on streaks or discipline alone, we started with body language, eye contact, posture, breath. Every time he resisted the urge, even for a day, he noted how much easier it was to look someone in the eye. After 2 weeks, his voice was steadier. His laugh came quicker. One day, he simply said, "I don't feel like I'm hiding anymore." That's the transformation. Not perfection, alignment. Not loud ego, quiet strength. The energy you release without intention doesn't just disappear. It takes a piece of your presence with it. And when you learn to keep that energy, to own it, people notice. Not because you said anything, but because something in you changed. Here's the lesson: every urge resisted is a vote for the man you're becoming. Every moment you hold your ground, even in silence, adds weight to your presence. But even with that awareness, there's still one trap many men fall into, one that keeps the cycle going even when they want to stop. Let's talk about that next: the shame loop, and how to finally break it. It's not the relapse that does the most damage, it's what follows after. One slip, one moment of giving in, and suddenly a wave of shame crashes over you. You tell yourself, I was doing so well, I ruined everything. That thought spirals. And without even noticing, you're back where you started, not because your will is weak, but because your relationship to failure hasn't changed. This is what we call the shame loop. It goes like this: urge, relapse, guilt, self-judgment, numbness, urge again. And it doesn't just hurt your streak, it drains your self-worth. The reason this loop is so powerful is because it's quiet. You're not being punished by someone else. You're punishing yourself with words, with thoughts, with that inner tone that says, you'll never get this right. I once worked with a man named Tyler. He was fiercely committed to self-improvement, journaling, gym, reading Stoic texts, but when he slipped, he unraveled. I don't even enjoy it anymore, he told me. I just feel weak after. And then I punish myself with 2 more days of binging. The problem wasn't just the habit. It was the story he attached to the habit. That he was broken. That he'd never measure up. That a real man wouldn't struggle with this. But what he needed wasn't more punishment, it was perspective. Together, we reframed relapse. Not as a defeat, but as data. When did it happen? What triggered it? What emotion was he avoiding? What environment made it easier to slip? Slowly, he began to see patterns. Late nights, isolation, lack of movement, and most importantly, self-hate always made it worse. Here's the truth: the discipline without compassion becomes self-destruction. You need both. The standard that says, I expect more from myself, and the softness that says, I'm still learning. Let's get back up. The Stoics understood this too. Marcus Aurelius wrote, when you stumble, get up. Don't dwell. Instead, begin again. He didn't say, beat yourself up. He said, begin again. That's your power, the ability to return to the path, not perfectly, but persistently. And when you stop feeding shame and start feeding awareness, something shifts. You begin to gain traction. Confidence returns. Not because you're flawless, but because you're no longer fooled by the lie that one slip defines you. And once that loop is broken, you're finally ready to confront what you were really chasing all along, not just pleasure, but a sense of power. And that's what we'll explore next. If you peel back the layers, beyond the screen, the urge, the quick fix, what you'll often find isn't lust. It's something deeper. It's the longing to feel in control, to feel alive, to feel like a man who can move through the world on his own terms. Porn promises that feeling in a counterfeit way. It gives you dominance without courage, pleasure without intimacy, control without commitment. But what your soul is truly starving for isn't more stimulation, it's more sovereignty. And you can feel the difference, can't you? There's a fire that ignites when you say no to an urge, a quiet strength that hums beneath the skin. And on the flip side, there's a dull ache that follows when you give in, not because the act itself is evil, but because deep down you know you gave your power away. This is where men get stuck chasing physical release when what they really need is internal alignment. I remember coaching a guy named Andra. On the surface, he struggled with porn, but when we dug deeper, he realized his biggest trigger wasn't boredom, it was powerlessness. Whenever he felt small, at work, in relationships, in life, he'd turn to porn as a way to feel in charge, even if just for a moment. But that power was fleeting, and afterward, he felt even smaller. So we flipped the script. We stopped asking, how do I quit? And started asking, how do I build real power? For Andra, that meant setting boundaries at work, lifting weights again, starting a side project he'd been avoiding for years. And as those actions stacked up, something wild happened. His urges didn't disappear, but they lost their grip. Because the real craving, the hunger for meaning, agency, and forward momentum was finally being fed. Here's the truth: most men never hear your sexual energy isn't dirty, it's directional. It points toward something. When misused, it numbs, but when aligned, it builds. Carl Jung once said that a man who doesn't face his shadow will project it onto others. And for many men, porn becomes a safe place to explore the shadow, the desire for power, domination, intensity, without consequence. But real maturity comes when you stop hiding from that part of yourself and start integrating it with wisdom. You want power? Don't chase it in pixels. Create it in reality, and that begins with discipline, not as punishment, but as a practice of kingship, a reclaiming of the throne inside your own life. Let's talk next about how the Stoics taught exactly that, how to build a fortress of self-command. The Stoics didn't believe in perfection. They believed in practice, in showing up each day, meeting your impulses like a warrior meets an opponent, with calm and clarity. To them, discipline wasn't about suppressing desire. It was about building a life so rooted in purpose that fleeting urges couldn't shake it. A fortress doesn't stop storms from coming, it simply stands through them. That's self-command. But how do you build that kind of strength in the age of algorithms, temptations, and late-night loneliness? It starts small, with systems. One of my clients, Jonah, had tried willpower for years. "I just have to be stronger," he'd say after each relapse. But it never lasted. So instead of focusing on being strong, we focused on being strategic. First, he mapped his triggers: late nights, boredom, stress. Then we built defenses, a shutdown routine before bed, cold showers to reset his nervous system, journaling urges instead of acting on them. He also practiced something the Stoics called premeditatio malorum, visualizing temptation before it hits, and planning his response with clarity, not emotion. It worked, not because he became a monk, but because he stopped being surprised. He started treating his urges like weather, temporary, predictable, and something you prepare for, not something you run from. And that's the shift. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Self-mastery doesn't mean you never fall. It means you respond with awareness instead of shame, structure instead of chaos. It's the difference between being ruled by your urges and ruling them. For Jonah, the moment he stopped waiting to feel strong and started building strong systems, everything changed. His confidence grew, his focus returned. He even started dating again, not from a place of need, but from grounded presence. Here's your takeaway: you don't need to become emotionless. You need to become equipped. The Stoics built rituals, routines, and mental frameworks to protect what mattered most: their clarity, their peace, their mission. And when you start building your own fortress, one habit, one system at a time, you stop living on defense. You start leading yourself. But as powerful as strategy is, it can't survive without fuel. So in the next part, we'll talk about how to replace resistance with intention, and why the key to lasting change isn't just avoiding pleasure, it's replacing it with something greater. Willpower is like a muscle, useful but limited, and if you rely on it alone, eventually it gives out. That's why trying to resist urges with sheer force rarely works long-term. You might hold off for a few days, maybe even a few weeks, but without a deeper shift, you're just playing defense, white-knuckling your way through waves that keep coming. The Stoics understood this. They didn't preach endless resistance. They taught redirection, taking the same energy that once pulled you toward distraction and channeling it into something that moves you forward. Think of it like this: a river doesn't stop flowing because you build a dam. It stops flooding when you guide its current into a new path. I once worked with Elijah, a young entrepreneur who had big ideas but struggled with follow-through. He came to me frustrated. "Every time I feel the urge, I fight it, and I lose. Then I hate myself." He thought he had a discipline problem, but what he really had was an empty space problem. So we changed the strategy. Instead of focusing on what not to do, we started identifying what to do instead, and more importantly, what would light him up. Evenings were his danger zone. That's when the urges hit hardest. So we filled that time with structure, light workouts, phone calls with friends, a nighttime walk while listening to podcasts on masculinity and Stoic thought. Within 2 weeks, his relapses dropped by 80, not because the urges disappeared, but because he no longer had to fight them. He was busy becoming someone else. That's the key: you don't eliminate desire, you evolve it. Pleasure isn't the enemy. Passive pleasure is. The kind that numbs, dulls, and leaves you emptier afterward. But pleasure tied to action, like creating, building, sweating, serving, fills you in a different way. It reinforces life, not escape. The Stoics taught this through the practice of euroia bio, living in harmony with one's nature. And part of that nature is to create, not just consume, to serve a mission greater than comfort. So ask yourself what's something you could build, learn, or commit to. That would make those urges feel small by comparison. Because the goal here isn't just to stop a habit. It's to start a life that excites you. And as you begin to replace instead of resist, you'll notice something else, a shift in how you feel, move, and engage with the world, a reconnection with the very energy you used to waste. And in the next part, we'll explore how to take that energy and turn it into your greatest fuel. There's a reason ancient warriors abstained from sex before battle. A reason monks, artists, and inventors throughout history practiced periods of celibacy. They weren't running from desire, they were redirecting it. That's the heart of transmutation, taking your raw, restless sexual energy and turning it into something powerful, a business, a vision, a transformation. Because this energy isn't just about lust, it's about life force, creation, fire. Most men have never been taught this. They think urges are something to suppress or indulge. But what if they're neither? What if they're fuel waiting to be aimed? Let me tell you about Karim. At 24, he felt stuck. He had talent, writing, filmmaking, but every time he started something, he'd lose steam. Nights were the hardest. He'd binge porn to unwind, then feel numb, uninspired. We didn't start with quitting cold turkey. We started by reframing the urge. I asked him, what if every time you feel that energy rise, it's not a distraction, it's a call to create? So he made a deal with himself. When the urge came, he'd write. Even if it was nonsense, even if it was hard, he'd pick up a pen instead of his phone. The first week was rocky, but by week 3 something clicked. He stopped seeing urges as problems, he saw them as sparks. And by week 6, he had a finished short film, raw, beautiful, and deeply personal. I didn't know I had that in me, he said, but he did. So do you. Transmutation isn't magic, it's simply awareness plus action. It's catching the fire before it consumes you and using it to light something worth building. Think of it like creative alchemy. That tension in your body, that restless craving, it can either leak out through a screen or rise up through your voice, your work, your leadership. The Stoics might not have used the word transmutation, but they lived it. They taught temperance, not in the sense of avoiding fire, but in the art of mastering it. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire while journaling about desire and discipline daily. His restraint wasn't weakness, it was focus. Here's the truth, your energy is either being spent or shaped. It's not about becoming a monk, it's about becoming dangerous in the best way possible, grounded, creative, magnetic. And when you start living this way, you don't just feel better, people feel you differently. They see something in your eyes, your posture, your presence. And that's what we'll explore next, how stepping into this new way of being begins to redefine your very identity as a man. Somewhere along the way, being a man quietly shifted from building to consuming, from creating value to chasing comfort, from forging identity through action to outsourcing it through screens, likes, and quick pleasure. And most of us didn't even notice it happening. We just woke up one day and realized we felt duller, less driven, more reactive, less alive. But here's the truth, men were never meant to live passively. Masculinity in its purest form is creative. It shapes, protects, builds, and leads. I once worked with Darren, a 29-year-old who felt disconnected from himself. I don't even know what kind of man I want to be anymore, he told me. He wasn't in crisis. He had a job, a routine, a social life. But everything felt beige, like he was watching his life instead of living it. We started simple. I asked, what did you love doing before the noise took over? He paused. Woodworking, he said. I haven't touched it since college. So he started again, one weekend project at a time. Cutting, sanding, shaping something real with his hands, and slowly he came back to life. Not because of the furniture, because of what it represented. He was creating again, using his hands, his energy, his focus, not to escape but to express. That's the power of shifting from consumption to creation. Every act of building, no matter how small, is a statement: I'm not here to take. I'm here to contribute. And that shift has ripple effects. You stop needing constant entertainment. You stop obsessing over validation. You stop chasing fake intimacy, because your days are filled with doing, not scrolling, with purpose, not passivity. The Stoics would call this living according to nature, not meaning trees and mountains, but your deepest nature as a man, to bring order where there's chaos, to act where there's stagnation, to leave something better than you found it. And when you begin to live this way, your identity doesn't come from what you avoid, but from what you build, from who you're becoming, brick by brick. Here's the lesson: your energy is sacred, and every time you spend it, you're casting a vote for the man you're becoming or the man you're settling for. But to sustain this identity shift, you need more than momentum, you need structure. And in the next part, we'll explore how your environment can either hold you back or quietly set you free. You can have the strongest intentions in the world, but if your environment works against you, it's like trying to run a marathon in ankle-deep mud. You might make it a few miles, but eventually you'll sink, because discipline isn't just about what you resist, it's about what surrounds you. Most men underestimate just how much their environment shapes their behavior. We think we're acting out of free will, when in reality we're reacting to cues: screens left unlocked, notifications buzzing, blank spaces in our calendar, darkness, silence, boredom, all waiting to whisper, "Just this once." But what if your environment could do the opposite? What if it could protect your focus, anchor your intention, and guide your energy? That's what happened with Jason, a client of mine who kept breaking his streaks after just a few days. Not because he didn't care, he cared deeply. But every evening, he'd find himself alone in his apartment, phone in hand, and within minutes, he'd slip. We didn't start with mindset. We started with his room. Together, we changed his setup. He removed his phone charger from his bedroom, installed a blue light filter after sunset, replaced dead zones with creative triggers, a keyboard, a book on stoicism, a notebook, scheduled nighttime calls with a mentor or friend twice a week. It wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate. And it worked, because once your environment aligns with your goals, your choices stop being battles. They start becoming defaults. The Stoics knew the power of space. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations during quiet moments away from court life, crafting internal clarity within external chaos. He couldn't always control the empire, but he could control his rituals, his routines, his atmosphere. And you can too. Here's the principle: make friction for the habits you want to break and remove friction from the habits you want to build. Don't just try to be stronger. Be smarter about what surrounds you. Build your room like a training ground, your phone like a tool, not a trap, your schedule like a shield. Because when your environment supports your higher self, you stop being in survival mode and start operating with flow. And once your space is on your side, the energy you've been preserving starts to compound, not just in focus, but in how the world responds to you. And that's what we'll explore next: how life starts giving back when you stop giving yourself away. Something unexpected happens when you stop chasing cheap pleasure. Life starts feeling richer, more vibrant, more connected, like the world itself begins to lean in and take notice. It's subtle at first. You walk a little taller. You look people in the eye a second longer. You speak with just a bit more certainty. And people respond, not because they know what changed, but because you have. See, when you hold on to your energy instead of wasting it, you radiate something. Call it presence, call it polarity, call it masculine charge. Whatever the word, people feel it. I remember Alex, a client who'd struggled with self-worth for years. He wasn't socially awkward, but he always felt invisible. Women overlooked him, coworkers talked over him, friends saw him as nice but never magnetic. When he began his retention journey, it wasn't just about quitting porn or masturbation. It was about reclaiming his dignity. And around week 3, he noticed something odd. A barista remembered his name. A coworker laughed at his joke before he finished. A woman at a bookstore struck up conversation without him saying a word. He hadn't changed his clothes. He hadn't hit the gym. But something in his energy had shifted. This is what happens when you stop leaking your life force. Your testosterone rises. Your posture straightens. Your eyes sharpen. But deeper than that, your sense of self returns and the world mirrors it back. Because the truth is, when you're constantly chasing pleasure, you signal need. When you withhold, not from fear, but from strength, you signal value. You're no longer seeking approval. You're no longer desperate for escape. You've become a man who can hold tension, delay gratification, and walk through life with quiet certainty. That's the kind of man people notice, not because he's trying to impress, but because he doesn't need to. The Stoics would call this euthymia, inner contentment that doesn't rise and fall with external rewards. It's the kind of stillness that makes space for real joy, not the synthetic highs of digital escape. Here's the lesson: when you stop chasing artificial highs, you make room for real ones: connection, purpose, momentum, depth. And life, like any wise partner, responds to integrity. But now comes the moment of truth. Will you keep living in the loop that numbs you, or step fully into the man you were meant to become? That's what we'll explore next: the masculine shift from dopamine slave to sovereign leader. Let's go there. There's a quiet revolution that happens when a man stops living at the mercy of his impulses. Not overnight, not with fireworks, but day by day, choice by choice, he begins to shift from reaction to response, from chaos to clarity. This is the masculine shift, moving from being a dopamine slave to becoming your own sovereign. It begins when you stop asking, "How do I get more pleasure?" and start asking, "What kind of man do I want to become?" I remember Sam, a software developer, soft-spoken but sharp. He'd been stuck in cycles for years: porn, gaming, fast food. He wasn't self-destructing, but he wasn't really living either. What hurt most wasn't the habits. It was the way they made him feel: inconsistent, hollow, quietly ashamed. When he started his retention journey, I didn't tell him to quit everything at once. I just asked him to track how he felt after each decision, each click, each scroll, each release. That awareness changed everything. He started noticing patterns: how his energy dipped for hours after relapsing, how his creativity dried up after binge watching, how his posture slouched when he skipped workouts. Bit by bit, he began making new choices, not out of guilt, but out of vision. He replaced evening scrolls with evening walks. He turned urges into journal entries. He moved from numbing out to checking in, and within weeks, people around him noticed. He spoke more clearly, led meetings with ease. A colleague even asked if he'd gotten a promotion. He hadn't. He just started carrying himself like a man who leads. That's what sovereignty looks like. Not perfection, presence. Not domination, direction. The Stoics taught that true freedom isn't doing whatever you want, whenever you want. It's choosing what's best, even when it's hard. Because that's where self-respect is born. And here's the most beautiful part of the masculine shift: you begin to trust yourself again. Your word means something. Your goals feel real. Your reflection stops being a stranger. No more empty promises. No more just this once. You're not perfect, but you're aligned. This is when momentum takes over. When each right choice reinforces the next. And the man you're becoming, he no longer needs to force change. He simply lives it. But there's one final gate to cross. One challenge every man must face if he wants to live with unshakable freedom. And it's not about controlling desire, it's about owning it. Let's talk about that next. There's a big misunderstanding when it comes to self-control. People think freedom means saying no to pleasure forever, that if you want to be disciplined, you have to live like a monk, repressing every urge and desire. But that's not freedom. That's fear wearing a mask of virtue. True freedom, the kind the Stoics spoke of, isn't about avoiding pleasure, it's about owning it, mastering it. Choosing when and how you engage from a place of clarity, not compulsion. It's the difference between being driven by desire and directing it. I remember Daniel, a high-performing sales manager who had tried every no-fap streak strategy out there. He could go weeks without slipping, but the tension would build until it exploded, usually during a stressful night alone, followed by guilt and a hard crash in motivation. When we spoke, I asked, "What if your goal isn't to kill the desire, but to understand it?" So we explored that. He realized that his urges came not from raw lust, but from emotional hunger, stress, loneliness, pressure to perform. And every time he fought those urges blindly, he actually gave them more power. What changed wasn't just his behavior. It was his relationship to pleasure. He started checking in with himself daily. Am I reaching for this because I'm tired, stressed, lonely, or because I actually want intimacy with my own life? That awareness made room for choice. And one day, he told me something powerful. It's not that I stopped feeling desire. I just stopped being afraid of it. That's when he became free. Because here's the thing, desire isn't the enemy. Unconscious desire is. The Stoics didn't run from pleasure. They simply refused to be ruled by it. Seneca said, "We must give up many things to which we are addicted, not because they are bad, but because we are too weak to master them." Freedom is the power to enjoy without attachment, to say yes when it aligns and no when it doesn't, without guilt, without fear, and without needing to explain yourself. It's presence over impulse. It's wisdom over reaction. It's desire, disciplined. And once you reach this level of inner command, you stop living in resistance and start living in rhythm. You become the kind of man who walks into the world with his eyes open, his mind clear, and his heart aligned. That's the doorway to becoming truly powerful. But the final question still remains, the one only you can answer: will you keep living in the cycle, or rise into the man who leads himself? Let's step into that final challenge together. There comes a moment in every man's journey where the next step isn't about more knowledge, it's about a decision. Not a dramatic one, not shouted from rooftops, just a quiet, firm yes to a new standard, and a gentle, permanent no to who you used to be. Maybe that moment is now. You've seen the cycle for what it is: the urge, the escape, the crash, the guilt. You've felt what it costs, not just in energy or time, but in respect for yourself. But you've also tasted something else: glimpses of clarity, moments of confidence, small wins that whisper, "This is who I could be if I didn't keep giving myself away." And that brings us to this: who do you choose to be now? I remember Marcus, a father of two who felt like he was failing silently. His kids adored him. His wife trusted him. But he knew behind the screen, in those private hours, he was still leaking his strength. One day he looked in the mirror and didn't see a bad man. He just saw a man out of alignment. So he made a promise not just to quit the habit, but to live like someone his kids could model. It wasn't perfect. There were relapses, doubts, hard nights, but there was also a fire, a why that burned brighter than his urges. That's the final challenge: to stop asking if you're addicted, normal, or too far gone, and start asking, what kind of legacy am I building right now, with every small choice I make? The man you want to be doesn't arrive someday when everything's fixed. He shows up the moment you act like him, even just for 5 minutes. The moment you say, "I've played small long enough. I've numbed myself long enough. I'm ready to lead my life." And from there you build, with structure, with support, with stories like the ones you've heard throughout this journey: real men, fighting silent battles, choosing strength over shame. Because you're not alone. You're part of a quiet brotherhood, men choosing sovereignty in a world that profits from their passivity. So as you close this video, don't just watch it end. Choose something, journal, breathe, text a friend, delete the app, set a challenge. Because this isn't the end of the video, it's the beginning of your momentum. And if you're ready to keep growing, keep building, and keep becoming the man you were born to be, then this channel is here for you. Subscribe, share this with a brother, and most of all, show up for yourself. Your journey to self-mastery doesn't start tomorrow. It starts right now.